I'm not sharing this for attention, I just don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that since this experience, I no longer feel safe, not even in my own apartment. It started small. I couldn't find my keys, even though I was sure I'd put them in my jacket pocket. The next day, I found them in the bathroom next to the sink. I wrote it off as forgetfulness, though a vague sense of unease began creeping in. Every day, there were more oddities. The kitchen clock ticking faster than usual, the lights flickering for just a second, although the rest of the house stayed lit. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. We all get tired. We all misplace things from time to time. But one night, as I lay in bed, teetering between wakefulness and sleep, I heard someone quietly open a door in the hallway. My heart raced, but I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. It never crossed my mind that there might be another explanation. The next night, I couldn't sleep. Faint rustling sounds around the apartment and the soft creaks of the wooden floor under someone's feet kept me on edge. When you live alone, any noise at night makes you think twice. I tried to sleep, but just as I began to relax, I heard it again, like someone cautiously moving around my apartment. I thought maybe a neighbor had somehow entered the wrong apartment, but the thought only made me more anxious. I wasn't prepared to get up and confront whoever it was. It was too terrifying, too real, as though something were simply standing there watching me in the dark. The next morning I checked the lock. Everything was intact. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints. Maybe I just imagined it all. Then things became even stranger. I came home to find my notebook open to the page with my address written on it. At first I thought I'd left it that way, but deep down I knew I always closed it, especially when it came to personal notes. Every morning I'd notice something new. Papers in my files were rearranged. Items on my desk were out of place, items I hadn't touched. Gradually, the feeling of insecurity grew unbearable. A week in, I couldn't sleep normally anymore. I lay there listening to every sound, trying not to move, afraid that something in the dark would sense me. And every time I drifted off, I'd feel as though someone was quietly, slowly moving through the apartment. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to conduct an experiment. Before going to bed, I set up a camera in the kitchen, aimed at the front door. In the morning, I reviewed the footage, and my heart froze. The camera captured someone or something sneaking into the room at 3 a.m. The shadow was vague, blurry, but the movements unmistakably pointed to someone being there. The next day, I noticed a few of my things had moved to new places. I couldn't dismiss it as a coincidence anymore. I set the camera up again in the living room that night. Reviewing the footage, I noticed something happened every night, always at the same time, 3 o'clock on the dot. Someone would carefully walk around the apartment, almost as if searching for something, brushing against the walls, barely touching the floor. And the scariest part was that, just before the recording ended, the shadow paused near my bedroom door, as if studying whatever was behind it. Then it vanished into the hallway darkness. After that, I realized I wasn't alone in the apartment. It might have been my mind playing tricks, but it didn't feel that way. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed listening to the sounds around me, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting, but nothing happened. The night passed in silence. The next morning, though, I felt something was wrong. A faint scratch had appeared on the living room wall, as if someone had dragged something sharp along the plaster. I didn't know what it meant, but I was sure of one thing. Something was very wrong with this apartment. A few days later, I invited a friend over to help me install hidden cameras throughout the apartment. I hoped the recordings would shed light on what was happening. We set up the cameras and planned to review the footage together in a week. The week passed in torment. I tried not to dwell on it, but every night, lying in bed, I could feel it that someone was watching me. I sensed its gaze, felt its presence as though it was standing right next to the bed, quietly breathing. There was no sound, no evidence of movement, but instinct told me I wasn't alone. A week later, my friend came over and we began going through the recordings. Goosebumps covered my skin as I watched each night's footage show the same thing, a barely visible figure moving along the walls, slipping into the shadows, pausing near my bedroom door. It all looked so real, but there was something indescribable about it, making me doubt, was this actually happening to me, or was it all in my mind? Then my friend suggested something that shook me to the core. He said he didn't see anyone else in the footage. Only me, moving from room to room each night, returning to bed as if I didn't realize it was me. In that moment, I understood that the entire situation was a creation of my own mind. Every night, driven by an internal fear, I was getting up and wandering around the apartment without even realizing it. All the rustling, the moved objects, and that unsettling presence were nothing but my own shadow, the nightmare that had overtaken my mind. After that, I could no longer bear to stay in the apartment. I moved, changed my life, but every time night falls, I feel that dark part of myself waking up again, ready to step out of the shadows and once more confront me. I always thought of myself as a rational, resilient person. You know, the type who can take a deep breath, count to 10 in any stressful situation, and keep going. But honestly, after what happened to me recently, I'm not so sure anymore. I'll try to recount everything as it was, without embellishment or exaggeration. Let this be a story from which each person can draw their own conclusions. A couple of months ago, I decided I needed a break. A weekend alone sounded perfect. With work, daily responsibilities, and stress piling up, my mind was starting to feel foggy. So I figured the ideal way to recharge would be to rent a small cabin in the woods, far from the city, disconnect from the internet, and just let myself unwind. I found a cabin on a rental site. Nothing special, but it looked cozy. A small wooden structure with a fireplace and modest furnishings, everything needed for a few days. The nearest town was about 15 kilometers away, but the nature surrounding it was stunning. Woods, mountains, silence. What could be better? I arrived in the morning, unloaded my things, and settled in. The cabin was small, with a kitchen, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a bedroom. There was an unusual silence in the house, but I liked it. This place promised the peace I had been longing for. I started a fire, opened a book I'd been wanting to read, and enjoyed the quiet. The days slipped by unnoticed, and by evening, I felt a gentle tiredness that I wanted to savor in silence. As dusk began to fall, I decided to take a walk through the woods nearby, breathing in the cool evening air. The forest felt mysterious, but safe: trees, bushes, dry branches underfoot. The only thing that felt odd was that it was so quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. When I got back, I settled by the fireplace again and continued reading. That was when I felt a slight unease. At first it seemed silly, like someone was watching me. You know that feeling when you're under a gaze you can't see. It seemed absurd. I was alone in the house. I brushed it off as nerves or fatigue, but the unease lingered. I went to bed but couldn't sleep for a long time. Every crackling of the fire, every sound from the other room seemed to amplify. Even the creaking of the floorboards as I shifted in bed felt too loud. It was as if someone was outside the walls, even though my mind kept insisting that couldn't be true. The next morning I tried to shake off the thoughts and simply enjoy my time. I busied myself with small chores around the cabin, made breakfast, but thoughts of that strange night kept swirling in my mind. At one point, while sitting in the kitchen, I heard a faint click from the bedroom, like a door quickly opening and closing. I got up, went to check everything was in place, but the feeling of something intangible grew stronger, like something hostile was in the house with me. Honestly, by then, I wanted to leave, but I told myself it was just my nerves, and I convinced myself to stay. After all, 2 days of rest were supposed to bring relaxation, not anxiety. The whole day passed in a sort of tense vigilance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even while walking through the forest, it felt like someone was trailing me, yet whenever I stopped, there was nothing. That night, again, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to every sound, trying not to succumb to paranoia. I heard strange knocks, rustling, creak sounds I knew well, yet they felt sinister in the darkness. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. Quiet, careful steps somewhere in the hallway. My pulse skyrocketed, my breathing quickened. I listened, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. But after a while, the steps stopped. In the morning, when I opened the bedroom door, I found a surprise: an empty mug on the table, though I distinctly remembered putting it away in the kitchen. No one could have entered. I checked everything. The windows were closed, the doors locked. Yet the mug stood there where it shouldn't have been. From that moment on, my thoughts spiraled. Fear seeped into every fiber of my body. It felt like any second now, someone unfamiliar would appear from around the corner. By evening, I could no longer stay in the cabin. Every creak of the walls, every sound echoed inside me. I had decided it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that it was time to go home. But I couldn't leave right away. The last few hours felt like a strange haze. Before leaving, I tried to understand where this anxiety had come from. After all, nothing truly frightening had happened. No otherworldly forces, no ghosts or strange creatures. I checked every detail in the house, every corner, every small thing that might explain my fears. You know, the scariest thing is silence. It can seep into your mind, wrapping around each thought. It sneaks up on you unnoticed and makes you think about things you don't want to consider. All this time, I was sure I was being followed, but in reality it was just my own mind left alone, far from the usual sounds and distractions. I never thought I would tell anyone about this. It's been a few years, and even now I'm still not sure what exactly happened. I try to convince myself that it was just a coincidence or a reaction to stress, but something about it still haunts me. It all started when I decided to rent an apartment closer to work. Back then, I was younger, ambitious, and ready to live in the city center despite the high cost. The apartment looked pretty ordinary, maybe a bit worn, high ceilings, cracked paint on the walls, creaky floors, but to me, it had a certain charm. The first few weeks were uneventful. The apartment became my cozy retreat from the chaos of work. But one evening, coming home late, I noticed a small detail I hadn't seen before. There was a bundle on the hallway floor, a few old newspapers rolled up and tied with a dirty string. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it. Inside was an article about a family who lived in the building back in the 1972nd. The husband had gone missing, leaving his wife with 2 kids. Alongside the article were other small news clippings and faded photographs, but nothing more. I put the newspapers back, assuming it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had just left them there. But the next day, there was another bundle in the same spot, only with an even older edition of newspapers. This one had notes about former residents from different apartments. I tried not to read too much into it, but it felt strange. Living alone, it was unsettling to find things appearing that I hadn't put there. One day, I came home early and heard someone mumbling in the neighboring apartment. The walls were thin, but I had never heard anyone in there before. I even asked the building manager, who assured me the apartment was empty. But when I went closer to the wall to listen, I could clearly hear a voice, as if someone were speaking right on the other side. The next day, I found yet another bundle of newspapers, this time directly under my door. I thought it had to be a prank, someone who knew it would scare me. I remembered an old woman who lived on the 2nd floor and would sometimes give me odd looks when we met in the elevator, so I figured it must be her. Still, I brushed it off as a coincidence and tried to ignore it, but a few days later I heard a noise at my bedroom door. It was early morning, barely dawn, and I was already awake, unable to sleep. It sounded like someone was quietly moving in the hallway. I didn't move, hoping it was just a trick of my imagination. But then, I heard someone cautiously approach the door and stop. That's when I realized the bedroom door was closed, so no one could be there. Eventually, I couldn't take it any longer. The knocking continued over and over, and this time I couldn't hold back. I jumped out of bed, threw open the door, and rushed into the hallway. No one was there. But something caught my eye. The door to the old closet was slightly open, even though I was sure it had always been shut. This unnerved me, as I had never once gone in there. Honestly, I didn't even know if anything was stored inside. I don't know what compelled me to check it out, but I went in. Inside the closet were old boxes, a cabinet covered with fabric, and dusty shelves. But there was one more detail I hadn't noticed at first: a tiny door in the corner, covered with a loose piece of plywood. I decided to try opening it. After some effort removing the plywood, I squeezed through. A narrow passage led to a tiny, windowless room. The walls were lined with faded, worn wallpaper. Looking around, I noticed children's toys scattered on the floor and an old crib. The room was frigid, almost freezing. I had a strange feeling that someone had lived here a long time ago, but had been simply forgotten. A couple of days later, I tried going back into the closet to see if the room was real or just a figment of my imagination, but the entrance was nailed shut as if it had never existed. It was then I knew I had to leave that place.